Click to subscribe. America after the Revolution. In 1783, after 8 years of fighting, the United States had won its war for independence from Britain. But the newly formed nation was in trouble. Its government, which had been designed only to serve during the war, no longer had a purpose. George Washington was elected the first president of the United States. But with no constitution or laws to guide them, this new country of 13 states was drifting apart. The people were tired of being governed by a central power and wanted as little government involvement in their lives as possible. There was no national currency, no national bank, no roads, no post offices, no uniform system of weights and measures. Each state functioned pretty much as its own little country. Though there were many problems with this type of government, the biggest issue facing the fledgling nation was the economy. In order to win the war, the states had borrowed money from foreign governments and from private investors. But now that the war was over, trade between the states and with other countries was difficult, because each state printed its own money, which was backed by a different amount of gold or silver. Imagine if Canada made every province print its own money, backed by maple syrup, wheat or lumber, instead of having one national currency backed by the entire Canadian economy. Trade would be very complicated. Also, the lack of a national bank meant that debts were impossible to settle and credit was non-existent. A farmer could get a loan to plant cotton or corn because there was no national bank to back up his note. So he turned to private bankers. But these people charged high interest rates and often demanded payment in gold or silver, which was in short supply. The result was that trade and industry across the new nation ground to a halt. All of this economic chaos led to calls for a new government that could stabilize the currency and set up a national bank. The Articles of Confederation collapse. In 1777, the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union became the governing document for the new United States. This agreement was based on the idea that the central government should have very limited power. Most power would rest with individual states. Under the Articles, there was no president and no national court system. Instead, the central government consisted of a Congress of states. Each state got one vote in Congress regardless of its size. This meant that a small state like New Hampshire had the same amount of power over national issues as a huge state like Virginia. Since most of the delegates at the Constitutional Convention represented smaller states, the larger states soon realized that they were at a disadvantage and began agitating for change. Many Americans also felt that under the Articles, taxes were too high and tariffs were too low. They wanted a strong central government that could regulate commerce and collect taxes to pay off the national debt. But perhaps the biggest problem with the Articles of Confederation was that it did not allow the central government to raise a national army. If disputes arose between states, they could only be settled by a costly and time-consuming process of going to the courts. In 1786, this problem almost led to war when Western farmers rebelled against the state of Massachusetts over land taxes. Known as Shays' Rebellion, this uprising showed the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation once again. Delegates from the states met to put down the rebellion, but they quickly realized that the Articles of Confederation prevented them from raising the army they needed to put down the rebellion. Even more importantly, they knew that if this uprising had been led by a foreign power, the Articles of Confederation would not allow the United States to defend itself. The Constitutional Convention begins. In May of 1787, delegates from all 13 states except Rhode Island met at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. Their goal was to revise the Articles of Confederation, but many of them soon realized that the best course of action was to draft a new governing document altogether. One of the most important compromises that needed to be made was how representation in the national government would work. Should smaller states like New Hampshire have the same amount of power as bigger states like Virginia? And what about counting enslaved people? Should they be counted when figuring out how much power each state has? These questions would ultimately determine whether the new government would represent the interests of the people. The Virginia Plan. The first plan offered was the Virginia Plan, presented by James Madison. It called for a new government with 3 separate branches: executive, legislative, and judicial, with a bicameral legislature, meaning 2 houses. In the first house, or lower chamber, states would be represented proportionally, meaning that states with larger populations would have more representatives than smaller states. This plan favored larger states because it gave them more power in the national government. The New Jersey Plan. The small states led by William Paterson responded to the Virginia Plan with the New Jersey Plan. This plan kept the Articles of Confederation's one state, one vote rule in the legislature and added a single-chamber legislature, or unicameral legislature, to the other two branches of government. This meant that big states wouldn't have any more power than small states in the legislature. The Great Compromise. For days, the convention was deadlocked between the two plans. Then a delegate from Connecticut named Roger Sherman proposed a compromise. The upper house of the national legislature would be made up of senators. Each state would get 2 senators regardless of its population. This meant that representation in the Senate would be equal. However, in the lower house, or chamber, representatives would be apportioned by population. This way, states with larger populations would have more representatives in the House of Representatives. And this compromise resolved the issue of how representation would work in the new government. The 3/5 Compromise. But there was still the issue of how enslaved people would be counted when figuring out how much power each state would have. Northern states didn't want slaves to count at all since they weren't allowed to vote. Southern states argued that if they didn't count, then they would have less power in the national government and therefore less power to protect the institution of slavery. If the convention couldn't come up with a solution, the whole thing could collapse. Then a delegate from the state of Connecticut stepped forward with a compromise. In figuring out how much power each state would have, every 5 enslaved people would count as 3 free people. This meant that the South would have more power in the national government than they would have if no enslaved people were counted at all. And this solved the issue of representation. Checks and balances. After the issue of representation was settled, the delegates had to figure out how to divide power between the 3 branches of government. James Madison suggested a system of checks and balances. This meant that each branch would have the power to limit the actions of the others. For example, if the executive branch, or president, makes a law, the legislative branch, or Congress, could overturn it. If Congress passed a law, the president could veto it. And if the president tried to make a law, Congress could refuse to approve it. This system of checks and balances prevents any one branch from becoming too powerful. The presidency. Once the framework of the new government was agreed upon, the delegates had to decide who would lead the executive branch. They decided to create the office of the President of the United States. To prevent the president from becoming too powerful, they created a system of elections to keep him accountable to the people. Every 4 years, the people would vote for a president. The president would then appoint a cabinet of advisors to head the various departments of the executive branch. The delegates also decided that the president would have the power to appoint judges to the new Supreme Court and other federal courts. This meant that the judicial branch would be dependent on the executive branch, and this dependency would keep the judicial branch from becoming too powerful. The Constitution is signed on September 17, 1787. After 4 months of debate and compromise, the delegates signed the United States Constitution. It was then sent to the states for ratification or approval. In order for the new government to go into effect, 9 states had to agree to it. The first state to ratify the Constitution was Delaware in December of 1787. By February of 1788, 8 more states had ratified the Constitution, bringing the total to 9. On March 4, 1789, the new government went into effect. The first election was held in the fall of 1788. George Washington was unanimously elected the first president of the United States. Ratification in the Bill of Rights. Though the Constitution was ratified or approved by most states, 2 did not ratify it. Why? Well, many people opposed the Constitution because it did not include a Bill of Rights or list of individual liberties. Some people thought the list of liberties in the Constitution was vague and didn't include enough freedoms. Others feared that a strong central government would use its power to take rights away from the people. But supporters of the Constitution argued that since the Constitution had a system of checks and balances and the power to tax and regulate commerce, it was actually more likely to protect liberty than the weak central government established by the Articles of Confederation. Supporters also argued that since the Constitution provided for an elected president, it would actually help to keep the central government accountable to the people. In the end, the supporters of the Constitution won out and the Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution in 1791. References. Thank you for watching this episode. If you want to keep learning about the new government, click here to watch this episode. If you want to keep learning about the founding of the United States, click here to watch this playlist. Subscribe so you never miss an exciting episode.